Folks, we're going to get started in a minute. We're just waiting to download a presentation, and then we'll get started directly after. Fair warning. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to call the Finance, Ways and Means Appropriations Subcommittee to order for April the 11th, 2022. Madam
Representatives Campbell, Faison, Garrett, Hazelwood, Hicks of Hawkins, Miller, Sexton of Granger, Shaw, Sparks, Zachary. You have a quorum.
Thank you. Do the members have any personal orders before we get started? Seeing none, before we go out of session, today's hearing is to focus and to gain a better understanding about the fiscal impacts associated with incarceration costs in Tennessee. As the members know, we've been having a lot of discussion over the last several years about what it costs to incarcerate citizens in our state. We're going to first hear from a group called Recidiviz. Wanted to thank them for coming today, who is a resource for our Department of Corrections as it relates to data analysis. And then we will hear from Department of Corrections as well, followed by none other than Krista Lee Karsner, as she gives us an update from a fiscal review standpoint regarding how we calculate fiscal notes as it relates to incarceration. For the members, all the supporting documents, including the presentations by the applicable entities today, are located on the dashboard. And so you can access those there if you can't see them on the screen. And so we're going to go out of session to hear first from Recidiviz. I know we have Evan Greenlow and some other folks with you. So if you will come straight to wherever you'd like at the table. We're going to let Recidiviz go first, and then it'll be Department of Corrections after, and then Ms. Karsner will come and she will testify, and then we're going to ask you guys to stay over. I think we got a few questions we'd like to ask for the entire group after the questions. And so, gentlemen, if you will, for the record, introduce yourselves and your title and the company you're with, and you can go ahead and get started.
Just me for now? Yeah. Okay. Can you guys hear me okay? Can you hear me all right? Wonderful. Thank you for having me, Mr. Chairman. My name is Evan Greenlow. I'm a state engagement manager with a nonprofit organization called Recidiviz. Recidiviz, which is not easy to spell, is a combination of the word recidivism and the word visualization to help better understand what drives recidivism, what may reduce recidivism. I've brought a handful of slides that are up that I can speak to today. The first part of it speaks generally about Recidiviz as an organization, who we are, what we do, and then the second part speaks more specifically to our partnership here in Tennessee with the Department of Corrections. Should I dive into it? Excellent. That's what I just said. So we've covered this slide. We're making good progress. So Recidiviz is a team of technologists. We are mostly software engineers and data scientists and designers that are committed to providing decision makers that ranges from policymakers such as yourself to leaders in departments of corrections to line staff across the state be able to make better decisions to drive better outcomes using criminal justice data. We're currently working in 8 states, including the state of Tennessee. You can see those here: North Dakota, Missouri, Michigan, Idaho, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Maine, and yourselves. We started our partnership with Tennessee formally in August of last year, so we're about 6 months into it. I'll speak a little bit more about that. And basically, the states that we partner with are the states that have the strongest interest in using data to make the best decisions. And so that's sort of how this crew of states has come about. We've got about 40 people that are spread across the country, And we build 4 main kinds of tools. The first is a data analytics platform. I'll speak to what that means in a moment. And then I spoke to a couple of the others for leaders and line staff, as well as tools for the public. So I think the right way to imagine the data analytics platform is represented by the little dots here. So the criminal justice system has a lot of inflows and outflows that get very complex as people move from prison to parole, from prison to probation, from probation and parole, either to liberty or back into the prison system. And so what our software engineers are doing is they are sort of organizing the data to extend the notion of looking at data at a point in time and to stretch it out over an individual's experience. So this is an example individual who spent 6 years on probation. They were in 4 different probation offices. They had 9 different supervising officers. And then at the end of that, they ended up spending 74 days in jail. So rather than just looking to see where they are at some point in time, well, do people who are done with parole perform if they've had 9 different supervising officers versus if they had the same one for 6 years? And how likely are they to end up in jail or back in prison? And we're able to look both at historical data and also to do projections looking forward that incorporate some of the nuances of case level data for individuals and their trends over time. So we have not yet built a formal population projection model in Tennessee. We'd be happy to. This is from an example in Idaho where we have. And what you're looking at here is you can imagine either for statewide or for a specific facility, you could take a look at historically based on the custody level that people were in, the number of infractions that they had, whether or not they had previously reoffended, what would be likely to be true in the future based on all of those movements. And there could be additional real-time specificity and insight from something like that. Other kinds of tools we build are sort of internal key performance indicator dashboards. So if you are a district director for supervision or a warden, you may want to have a key set of metrics you're trying to achieve and be able to know, well, which individuals, which correctional officers or probation or parole officers are achieving the target outcomes with what level of frequency, and how can we perhaps invest more in training for people who need help or uplift those who are achieving the outcomes we're looking for. So on the whole, Recidivis's value to state partners is we make it easier for the state to ask questions of its own data, to guide its staff towards best practices, and also, I think importantly, to be recognized for your incredible progress. We've enjoyed seeing the progress Tennessee has been making, policymakers have been making, administrators have been making, and want to be able to uplift the story when things go well as well. So that's Recidiviz generally, some of the work we've done in other states and how we work as an organization. Specifically here in Tennessee, as I mentioned earlier, the contract began August 15th. It runs for 3 years. So we're 6 months into a 3-year contract. And the scope of our contract was focused on 3 main areas: to diagnose and surface potential issues, to monitor the success of any ongoing initiatives, and to guide planning and policy for positive outcomes. So one of the first areas we've dug into in Tennessee, and why we're sort of here as a part of this today, was trying to better understand sentencing and sentencing credits in Tennessee, because this too can be incredibly complex. So the distributions that you're looking at here are a representation of the program credits and the behavior credits that can reduce the length of time that somebody would serve incarcerated in a facility. And you'll notice a couple different spikes here. So there's a very large yellow spike at the 6 to 8 day range, because the policy suggests that if you are in a TDOC facility, the most days you can earn off per month is 6 to 8. Whereas in jails, you can earn up to a total of 30 days. And so you can see those distributions. And later we can sort of disentangle questions that I know are very important to understand what is the average length going to be, the maximum length going to be, the distribution of lengths. And we can provide insights that suggest things like this. So on average, credits account for a 22% reduction in total sentence length in Tennessee. And you can see this distribution here of, well, what share of the time is it less than 10% or more than 40% of the length of a sentence that is reduced? One final note that I'll share is, importantly, this is not causal. This is not to say this is because A, therefore B. This is correlational, but I think still also interesting. We took a look at individuals within Tennessee Department of Corrections facilities and said, based on the number of credits they could earn, do the people who most of the credits they could fare any differently in terms of future crime than those who don't earn the credits who are available to them? And so what you're looking at here is that people who earned the bottom third of potentially available credits ended up re-entering the system, whether probation or prison, about 20 to 25% more often than those who earned all of their credits. So that 6 percentage point gap from 19 to 25. So that's a little bit of the overview of the kind of work we've been doing in support of TDOC. There are plenty of other things we could speak to, but that's all I have in the slides for now.
Thank you for your testimony today. If you guys don't mind, you just hang out for a minute. We'll have some questions. I've already got a list started. And so next up, we have today CFO Bo Irvin, I guess, and Lisa Parks. I understand the commissioner couldn't make it today. I hope they get to feeling better. But if you could please introduce yourselves, and you can proceed with your presentation as well.
Mr. Chairman, just to clarify one thing, it may be confusing because I'm sitting at this table, but I'm Kelly Young. I'm the Inspector General for the Tennessee Department of Corrections. So just want to make sure we're all clear who works for who.
Yes, thank you. You can go ahead and introduce yourself. My apologies.
No
I
problem.
thought these two were coming because of your colleague not being here today.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, and Commissioner Helton does apologize for her not being here today. I am filling in for her. As I said, my name is Kelly Young. I'm the Inspector General for the Tennessee Department of Correction. One of the spheres that I'm over in my role is contracts and contract monitoring. Hence my knowledge of our relationship with recidivism. As Mr. Evan Greenlow pointed out, we've had the contract in place for about 6 months. The purpose being to ingest, digest, and analyze TDOC data. One thing that's important to point out and clarify with this information that's being analyzed is this is all public information. This is information that's available to anybody who wants it. And the usefulness of recidivism is taking this humongous fountain of knowledge and data and bringing it all together to tell us what it means. It's sitting here, it's sitting here. It's helpful for somebody with expertise in corrections data to bring it together so we have a clear picture. And so some of that data does drive the way we look at policies and approaches to things like sentence reform or even policies within our own department. So the relationship thus far has been very helpful and will, I believe, continue to be helpful going forward. As Chairman, you stated, we're also here to talk about TDOC's approach to calculation of fiscal notes. Just as a general lead into that, the approach, and CFO Irvin and our Director of Budget, Lisa Parks, can go into the weeds as needed by questions, has been the same and pretty much untouched since 2009 when we received the memo guidance from the Fiscal Review Committee, 2009 memo, with the methodologies and criteria and direction on how to determine fiscal notes. So since that time and up till current, that is the methodology that has been used and continues to be used in cooperation and through the guidance of the Fiscal Review Committee. With regard to the Truth in Sentencing bill that we're speaking of today, that is the same methodology that was used. And to answer any questions the committee may have or to go in more detail, I will turn it over to our CFO, Bo Irvin, and Director of Budget.
Thank you. Did you have anything to add, or would you like to wait till?
Just
Yes.
one thing additional that I wanted to add is what Inspector General Young said is when we calculate and present to fiscal review every year, which we're glad to do, we work in partnership with them, our admission data, we have been using the same method for calculating our fiscal notes over the past several years. And we just we do a 10-year average on the admissions. We do update the most recent year's data on the front end, and then we drop off the longest, or the one that's furthest out. So we maintain a 10-year average every year. And what that allows us to do is be consistent with the prior year, the data that we use for fiscal notes. We're only substituting that most recent year with the latest year that falls off.
Thank you. Of course, we'll have some more questions regarding that. I think there's some confusion, I think would be the best way to describe it as to how your number ends up being different than fiscal review's number if we're both using the same basis of data. And so hopefully we'll be able to answer that question today. Next up, Ms. Carson, would you like to come up? You can grab a seat there, and then we'll have those gentlemen join us as well. We all know who you are, but if you will, share for the record who you are and your title, and then you may proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Williams. Crystal Lee Karsner, Executive Director of the Fiscal Review Committee. Thank you for having me today. I know that there have been several questions and concerns both in the legislature and in the media regarding the difference estimates on the Truth in Sentencing, House Bill 2656 and Senate Bill 2248. So hopefully I can clarify some of that in our approach versus the department's approach. So first, I'm going to kind of lay out the variables that went into our analysis, the variables that went into the Department of Corrections analysis, and also how we got, hopefully how we. So with all incarceration bills, not just the Truth in Sentencing bill, we look at average admissions, average sentence, and average time served. And this is data that we received from the department, and it includes data over the previous 10-year period. Population growth rate, because statutorily we're required to do the highest cost in current dollars over the next 10 fiscal years. So population data, growth data helps us do that. And that's something that we on a fiscal review staff determine each year. Recidivism discount factor, and this is an annual calculation that the department does for us as to what they are experiencing in that area. And then cost per day, previously to this year, we were using a weighted cost per day based on the department's budget. We did work with the department this fall and came up with an average state cost and an average local cost for the state to reimburse the locals for those felons that are housed in local facilities. And this was based on the legislation that was passed last year as to how we calculate the methodology for incarceration. So what is in the Department of Corrections estimate? It's the exact same information. So this is where I think everything gets confusing because we're coming up with different numbers. So here are some of the big differences in our analysis versus the Department of Corrections. On the admission data, so this all comes from the department. The department is using admission data, which includes admissions that may include multiple offenses or multiple sentences for those offenders. For our part, we are looking at admission data strictly for whatever sentence is being impacted by the legislation. Time sentence and time served. Again, it appeared from what the department provided us that they were looking at the specifics for those groups, but sometimes they were also using felony class data. So the average for an E felony or the average time served or sentence for a felony, something like that, where we were looking at what they had provided for those individual offenses admissions. So the time that the impact will be incurred, the department looked at all offense extensions going into effect the first fiscal year after passage, so next fiscal year, where we looked at, especially with truth in sentencing. So we are not assuming new admissions, but we're extending the time frame in which someone admitted will serve. So we looked at what the individual is serving now and what the extension will be, and tried to start the impact at the time that the extension would occur. And then for the 10-year period, Statute requires all of the recurring amounts to be the highest of the next 10 fiscal years. So we limited our estimate to include only costs in those 10 fiscal years. Some of corrections data went beyond that. And so that's a difference in the cost. So this is how they line up, looking at them side by side. TDOC assumed the highest of the next 10 years would be $95.89 million. We assumed $40.7 million, and that's how they play out per fiscal year. One of the things, though, that I want to point out with incarceration costs, and I think this gets confusing when we talk about the fiscal note of an incarceration bill. So statutorily, we are required to account for the highest cost in the next 10 years. And if that bill is passed, then the appropriation is a recurring amount based on really what the bill is going to cost. Typically, the cost of incarceration legislation builds up and continues to grow over time. So over that 10-year period, we are estimating that the cost of this legislation for the full 10 years will be $256 million. In appropriations, though, because of how we appropriate funds, the department will receive over that same period of time $406.9 million. So while our estimate is lower than the Department of Corrections, I do feel confident in it because we know that we are over appropriating and covering whatever cost might be there in case we are slightly less or on the lower end of the estimate of what actually occurs. Also, right now, this is all based on the bill as originally proposed. There is an amendment that's traveling with the bill and as it sits in finance. So just to touch on this, and this is our estimate, the estimated cost for the amendment would be $159.7 million. Appropriations would end up being $277 million over that period of time. So again, we're still appropriating more to cover any variation that may occur over that period of time. And that is all I had.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Carson. I do have a few questions. If you folks want to come back up, I'm happy to have a few questions on the list here just to kind of get an idea. I want to say once again, thank you guys for coming. I think there is already I've found a little bit of variance between those. But before we go to Chair Lady Hazelwood, I just thought I would clarify something. So when we're calculating the fiscal note, Ms. Carson, when we're calculating the fiscal note, you're seeing it as the net change between what originally was in the budget and what, and they may be accounting for it entirely new and not the difference. Is that a fair statement, or am I lost?
Well, I don't want to speak for them on what they calculate,
Right.
but it appeared in the their submission of their analysis that there were several costs starting in year one, which in our opinion, that would not occur. Our opinion, several of them would start, I think our analysis showed 2 years out when they would actually start. So that when you're doing a highest of a 10-year period, starting sooner adds to that cumulative value where it looks higher than where our analysis is.
Okay. Before I go to Chair Lady Hazelwood, Mr. Greenlove, if you will come join as well. I think there are a few questions for you as well. But first on my list, Chair Lady Hazelwood, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon. Thank you all for coming and helping to enlighten us. And I'm just going to start with questions for Mr. Greenlaw. I'm not familiar with recidivism, so if you could just tell me a little bit about how your company came to be, where you're located, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Can you hear me? It is now?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Recidiviz is a little over 3 years old. Our co-founders are former employees of Google. who had personal connections to the criminal justice system that observed that there aren't a whole lot of top software engineers that are looking to figure out how to bring world-class data science insights to corrections and criminal justice fields, and wanted to help change that. And so the organization has been growing over the last 3 years and has been building partnerships with states to be able to provide those insights.
Thank you. So I guess that brings up another question. You're a young company. So how did you come in contact with the state of Tennessee? Did you reach out to us? Did someone from our state reach out to you? How did that relationship begin?
One of our senior advisors is John Tilley, the former secretary of the Department of Corrections in Kentucky. And he and Commissioner Parker at the time were discussing some of the work that we were doing, and that was how the relationship began.
And so you, and I do know John, so John connected you all through the former commissioner, is that correct?
That's correct.
And then I guess, how did you start the procurement process? I mean, was there a contract on the table, or, and maybe Mr. Young, it looks like you want to answer that.
Yes, thank you. It might be easier just now that we're starting the state process of the procurement. So as Mr. Lowe stated, that recidivist came to our attention through the commissioner. We then entered into discussions. What exactly does recidivist do, and what do they bring into the table? Then there was several questions that had to be answered. One was, how we're going to do this procurement and what funding is there to do this. Ultimately, the vast majority of the contract was funded through JAG grant funds through OCJP. So a federal grant is funding $400,000 of the $450,000. In conversations with recidivists, once we kind of knew the scope of what was happening, myself, I began conversations with Central Procurement Office, as well as the Comptroller's Office, as well as STS. Knowing the scope that they were going to be doing, I wanted to speak to them about the logistics of what's going to be the correct path to go with regard to recidivism. Part of what we considered was the services provided background of what, if any, competition is out there. What we discovered was, and it was specifically listed in the justification for this contract, was that obviously there are companies that do data analysis. However, Recidiviz specializes in the analysis, integration, and aggregation of corrections-related data. Also, we considered that in one of the states that they're contracting with, which is Michigan, Michigan actually ran an RFP for these services, and Recidiviz was the only bidder for those services. Taking all of that into account, we entered into a sole source contract with Recidiviz with the justification that I just mentioned here, which was ultimately approved by CPO, COT, and the Fiscal Review Committee.
Chair Lady Hazel.
So if I'm understanding correctly, in your opinion, there was no one else that could do this particular work, and that was your justification for yet another sole source contract, which I think you all in the department, Recidiviz might not be aware of this, but the legislature has some issues with the number of sole source contracts that are out there. So again, I heard your explanation, but there are other companies. I did hear you say there are other companies who do data analysis, just not specifically in this field, targeted in this area.
With that specialization, correct.
And this company at that point been in business in 2 years. So what sort of track record did they have?
At that point, well, actually, that's a company question. I'll probably be better to turn that over to Mr. Greenlow, who knows the company's
No, I
history.
think the question would be to you, what kind of track record did you look to see that they had?
During the series of conversations, and it's been a while, so forgive me if I get the state wrong, but I believe it was Colorado that they had done work, which we looked at the quality of the work done there. They had also done work in Pennsylvania and had a public-facing dashboard in Pennsylvania with the digestion and aggregation of their correction data. So we were able to see the quality of the work with regard to that interpretation of that data and how it was projected, which showed that they were very capable of doing the work that we were seeking.
Right, I don't want to take up all the time, Chairman. If you,
Thank-
I may have other questions if you come back to me later.
Yes, ma'am. Just to follow up on the question before I go to the next one, as it related to recidivism, I did do some research as to what the chair lady was saying about experience in this space. I recognize that we, in a lot of cases, in particularly in data and information systems, we're constantly finding folks that are the specialists in their field. I did, however, look at the Pennsylvania data on the website and noticed that it was really just a regurgitation of the total data for Pennsylvania, the number of people that were incarcerated, what race or ethnicity they were, and one of 4 reasons why they might have recidivated. I guess, is that the length, width, and breadth of the work that you've done in Pennsylvania, or is there somewhere else on your website that one might find the level of detail that they made a decision on when it comes to Pennsylvania?
Of course. So I think the answer to both the question is that the length, width, and breadth is no. And is there somewhere else on the website that you could find more is also no. The vast majority of analytical insights that would be made for corrections would require personally identifiable information that you wouldn't want to have publicly available. And so the Spotlight dashboard is, when we looked earlier at the 4 different types of tools, falls into the public data tools, which are necessarily going to be far more simplified than any of the more sophisticated analyses that you would only want available to internal correctional leaders. And so in the same way that we wouldn't ever want to share anything that was Tennessee specific information you wouldn't want other states to know, that's why you don't see the more complex insights from other states.
I recognize the need for being able to keep that information private as it relates to each individual, but in your presentation, you did show an individual's record as it related to the last 6 years and the time in which they were incarcerated. What makes that okay and not what you're proposing in other states okay?
That was an example.
So that wasn't a real case scenario
No.
that you're providing. Okay. Just as another quick question, because his name was mentioned earlier, the former commissioner, is he now on retainer or work for recidivism at all? Just happens to communicate similar ideas as it relates to truth in sentencing. Is that the case? Because I read an article the other day, and I wanted to make sure that that's not the case. But
he doesn't have any formal involvement with our organization.
Thank you. Next on my list is Chairman Hicks. Chairman Hicks, you're right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here, ladies as well. Let's go back just for a second, and a lot of the questions that I had, the chair lady kind of touched on them, but I do have just a little bit of follow-up on those because I want to make sure that I heard you correctly. One of the things was, tell me again, and this may be for you, General Young, exactly. So what were your qualifications? What exactly, I guess, help me understand what you were looking for. And again, I don't mean to beat a dead horse here, but tell me again, what were the qualifications of recidivism again?
Sure. So what we as TDOC are interested in a contract such as this is what they specialize, which is the aggregation and analysis of data, but also importantly, what does that data mean? So what direction can that point us in? What sort of policies does it affect? What different ways can we think of to be creative with regard to addressing issues that may be brought up by the aggregation of this data? And so one of the main benefits, as I've already stated, was their specialization with corrections data, which is specialized data, understanding what that data is telling you, and then figuring out. TDOC is guilty as anybody of acronyms and abbreviations and things like that to speak our language. So having a heads up and a foot up on understanding that language, but also with recidivists doing this same work in other states, even the work they're doing in other states helps to also educate us on trends. So maybe our data in a silo in Tennessee tells us one thing, but that same data that may be our trend that we're seeing in another state they're working in that they have knowledge of helps us to think creatively about criminal justice reform, internal policies, and things of that nature. So it was the expertise as well as the scope of the work they're doing nationwide.
Okay. And Mr. Chairman, I'm going to bounce back and forth if that's okay. I have a question now, just going to come back to you now, Mr. Greenlow. So as you look at the data and you look at Tennessee, so what are your goals for Tennessee as you begin to look at Tennessee? What what was the goal of Recidiviz as you looked at getting the contract? Now what? I guess let me ask you that.
So our goal is to improve public safety, reduce time, reduce crime, to support the well-being of the citizens of any state that we serve. And so we're looking whether it's for individuals who are on supervision, what can guide them to have successful outcomes, so they're not reoffending, coming back into the system. While people are incarcerated, what is the programming that might be most helpful to them being able to be successful? We're trying to help the state visualize how to reduce recidivism.
So what has set your company apart from, as General Young mentioned, there's some other companies in the same market as you, same niche. So what sets your company apart? What are you doing that everyone else isn't doing?
It's a great question. I think in corrections, the structure of data is really critical. So you may get a split sentence, you may have a dual sentence, you may have multiple charges on the same sentence, and understanding the context of criminal justice data requires an understanding not only of big data or of analytics or of general data analytics software. It requires the specific intersection of understanding the flows of individuals between incarceration, supervision, and liberty, and the hundreds of little edge cases that can exist. And so the feeling I was having when you were asking how could it possibly be true that 2 years in you guys were the expert was because no one else had more than 0 years. And so we're looking forward to having closer to 50 states on board and 20 years of experience, but I just don't think anyone else had really taken this approach within the correction space before.
And so at this point, the $400,000 that the JAG grant that was awarded last year, what has the state received from that $400,000 grant at this point?
So I'm actually driving to Memphis tomorrow, back here the day after, and Knoxville the day after that. We're rolling out a tool to be used by parole and probation officers that should assist them in making sure that they're aware of the contacts that they need to make each month, and to better ensure that they're having the right supervision with the people who they're overseeing at the right level, moving their resources to the right places. We have started to share a draft working tool for feedback of a tool that enables administrators within the department to be able to select with more nuance and breadth and depth to see what are all of the transitions. So if I want to look at a specific facility and which individuals were released from that facility to supervision and how often they were revoked, I can select that for all of those different elements. So that's where we've gotten to so far 6 months in. I'm looking forward to doing more.
And so, excuse me, the original contract or the original grants, $400,000. And if you look at the contract, there towards the end, there's another $25,000 that will be appropriated in fiscal year 24, I do believe. I believe it was 25, maybe it was 50. It could have been 50,000. Yeah. What will that be used for? What will the additional $50,000 be utilized?
Yeah, so Recidiviz has a wide range of costs. Quality data scientists and software engineers have high salaries, and offices, and even just the cost of hosting the data is quite a bit. We actually raise quite a bit from philanthropists to be able to subsidize the cost for the state because we're a nonprofit. And so both the initial 400,000 and the remaining 50,000 all go basically to either the data hosting and data processing costs or to the salaries of the individuals performing the work for the state.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chairlady, I think you had a follow-up. Chairlady Hazelwood.
You said that you're traveling to Memphis, Nashville, and Knoxville. So welcome to Tennessee.
Thank
It's
you.
a long state.
Yes.
It take you a while. And going over this information with parole officers, who developed these criteria? Who determined that these are the rules that they should be following?
The Department of Corrections has its own internal policies. What we find is that when tools are built, they're often built for a specific purpose. So there might be some information that STS is storing in a facilities-oriented database. There might be some information that's stored in a parole-oriented database. There may be a number of distributed applications that are hosting data. And what we hear is that it's an incredible drain on the parole and probation officer's time to be checking all of these different systems and observing. And so a lot of the work Recidiviz is doing is pulling together the information in these disparate systems and surfacing the most relevant individual pieces of the TDOC's policies to guide the decision-making in line with best practice. So we're not inventing new protocols for people to follow. We're making it easier for them to follow what already exists.
But your expertise is prioritizing those and determining which of those protocols are best practice.
I think the internal department policies just specify, so like best practice might be something like, if you are on medium supervision, you should have 2 home visits and a virtual visit within this period of time. And because there are a half dozen different types of levels of supervision you might be on and a half dozen different types of visits you might make, piecing together how those should be paired and doing that with 100% compliance can be both challenging and time consuming. And so the tool is not saying this is what you should do. It doesn't have an opinion other than what the internal policy is. It just makes it easier to actually do that.
I'm still a little fuzzy on how, but I'll let you move on, Chairman.
Thank you. I just had a follow-up to a question earlier for the general. At the bottom of the single source contract and the PO, there was something that kind of struck me as unique or different, and it may be because Mr. Greenlow issued it later. There's a footnote at the bottom that says funding for the FY23, which is at no cost or zero, to the state and provided at no cost to the state and provided by recidivists via grants and donations. Unusual to see that in a PO. Maybe Mr. Greenlow wants to answer that question. But is that the reason why you skip a year in the PO going from 400 a JAG grant with approval through fiscal review, skip a year as it relates to any investment, and then a $50,000 investment after that? Feel free to tag team or
I'm
one of
happy
you
to
pick.
start if
Yeah.
you'd like. Yeah, I was just going to say we do. We had philanthropists who basically were able to say, we would like to see that the state of Tennessee is interested in this. We believe that if the state of Tennessee is invested, that they'll, apply the good work. And if we see that they can do that, we can cover the majority of the costs in the latter years. And so that was able to reduce the cost for those years.
Thank you. I guess one of the things that we have a little bit of concern here in the 3-starred, 3-grand divisions of the state of Tennessee is who influences the decision makers or the thought, the thinking in the state. I guess a little bit of concern to think that philanthropists from the state of California might be using Tennessee as an opportunity to invest their dollars. Would you, if you were sitting in our chair, would you be concerned at all that the view of someone from another state who's contributing here, their views regarding incarceration might influence the data or the interpretation of it?
Recidivism can sort of only exist if we're incredibly nonpartisan. If we want to work in different states and we're biased toward one, that's not going to work very well. Our philanthropists span the political spectrum as well as all of the states, and the states we work in are a pretty good balance. I think principally the question, can that be an issue, is 100% yes. I think we try and take great care to balance that because that's the only way our work will be received well.
Well, and I appreciate the work you're doing. I was able to read up. I don't think anybody, I don't think anybody's, based upon what I've read, is getting paid handsomely to do this. I read many articles about California and how many, like your original partners from Google, left their high-paying jobs to come make very little, which we appreciate that. Could you differentiate for me the difference between, or is there any connection between recidivism in California and recidivism where this contract was as it relates to Provo, Utah? Is it just coincidental they have the same name, or it seems to be around since 2015? Is one a nonprofit and one a corporation? Do you know what the difference between the two are?
I wish I had our sort of director of operations with us. I won't have all of the specifics. So there's only one recidivist. We have offices in San Francisco and New York because that's where a lot of our software engineers come from and therefore live and work. We also have folks in probably 12 other states across the country. So there isn't a California specific recidivist organization. I think the founders were from Utah. And so I don't know in what direction the nonprofit status may have migrated from one state to the other, but it's the same organization just sort of representing our maturation as a company over time.
Thank you. Representative Shaw, I think you had a question.
Mr. Chairman, I do thank you. And I have two, but maybe this one might answer both. If I'm an inmate serving 10 years in corrections in Tennessee, what advantage is your company to me?
I think my answer would be presumably you want to be able to succeed once you leave prison in your community. You want to find a good job. You want to have good community relationships. You want to remain in the community and not return to prison. And Recidiviz is ideally going to help on matching and program allocation to what might be most helpful for your risk and for your needs, to support you on supervision, and to find a way to reduce the probability that perhaps due to the lack of a job or something like that, you may find yourself doing something that would bring you back to prison. And so those would be improvements to your quality of life.
Representative Shaw.
Thank you. So do every inmate, now we know if you're serving life, probably not, but every inmate that possibly is going to get parole will get this service? Or do they have to request this service? How does that work?
Sure. It would be available to every person who is in prison and available to every person being released from prison. So even if you were never leaving, if there were programming opportunities, that would be available to you. Recidiviz is only 35 people. So we are, of course, not interacting with the 20-something thousand people, but through our partnership with the leadership team and the way those tools can be used by their wardens and their unit leaders, they will all have access to these insights to be able to make those improvements.
Representative Shaw.
Thank you. Then I would turn to the department. Do you all is this service provided to every inmate? How does the inmates get this service? And having had some experience with, when you talk about recidivism, having had some experience with trying to help people once they are paroled from corrections, do you all give this, make sure that every inmate get this information? Because I've never heard an inmate say anything about it. So can you help me with that?
Yes, sir. Thank you. So obviously, as stated before, we're at what I would call the infancy of this contract. So obviously, these things are being developed. The analysis of data is still ongoing. The development of these tools being discussed is still ongoing. So at this exact moment, we don't have one to give at this particular moment. That being said, the idea always has been that once we have those dashboards and those tools, that information, like I said earlier, that's public, for the most part, public information. The information that would go out to everybody is public information, statistics, programming, or whatever. We want that information to be available to all. And we will make sure through various mechanisms that that is available to anyone who wants to ingest it, digest it, and review it.
Last question, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Shaw.
I guess then I asked it because I know that there are a lot of organizations now who look forward to trying to help inmates once they are dismissed from prison. Would this, I guess this could take the place of that. So it wouldn't be no need of church organizations. If we're going to pay for it, why would we need church organizations and other people out there trying to help people who are getting parole from prison if your company is going to do that? I guess that anybody want to take that?
If I may, I think the way I would describe what Recidiviz does is not that we replace service providers. It's more that we are helping to match service providers to make sure that the right people are getting the right services based on their needs. And so it would make the work that all of those organizations are doing more effective rather than removing the need for it.
Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all. Quick question. Looking at your partners, Missouri, Colorado, et cetera, which has been the longest serving partnership?
The two longest partnerships have been with Idaho and North Dakota. They were the first two. They're smaller states, and it was easier to begin there.
So for how long? This contract is
Close to
3
the
years.
full 3 years. We
3
basically
years.
came into existence working with them.
So that was one of my questions, and you've actually answered that. What are the long-term goals, short-term goals? And you mentioned reduce crime, recidivism. So how successful, coming up on the 3-year contract, would you say you all were in reducing recidivism, reducing crime, et cetera, et cetera?
I think we have identified and observed cohorts of individuals in both Idaho and North Dakota where perhaps because of specific program enrollment or program referral, we've noticed those cohorts have lower recidivism rates. I wouldn't say that in the 3 years since we were born, we've eliminated recidivism in either of those states, but we do have some case studies of groups of individuals that have fared better in part because of the services we provide.
Okay.
Representative Miller.
General Young, have you followed up on, I guess, reaching out to some of the partners to see what their experiences have been?
So I specifically have not. We have a team, as Mr. Lowe stated, there's an executive team that works with him. So I specifically have not.
Okay. I mean, do you all plan to do it or at some point?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative. Just to follow up earlier, of course, I have to do a little research before I get here, but I did notice in the Tennessee tab that on the dashboard for Tennessee tab, it says it's under construction or there's no data there. I guess the question is we're 6 months in, about a $400,000 investment through this JAG fund. I guess the question is how long typically does it take for you to be able to, put something on the screen or show us an update on where we are? I understand from Chair Lady Hazelwood's questions that you're going to Knoxville, Memphis, and here in Nashville. So what can we expect to actually see some results for the investment we've made over the last 6 months?
For sure. I'll segment out into a couple of places. One is, there are things we could share now, like work has been done and work has been completed. And if there were specific requests, that's something that we could provide. The second is that the beginning is necessarily the slowest period of time. So the first thing you have to do is receive all of the data from the state. Then you sort of have to map all of that data to what we call a universal schema to understand data, not just at a point in time, but for individuals over time. And then you can build out the tools. And so this week, it was actually somewhat fortunate timing that the hearing was today. We were planning on rolling out a statewide training with the first of those tools, having brought in the data. And so, working closely with the community supervision team, I would say if a few months from now, they look at the results of that and there are findings and they want to share those publicly, we'd be glad to put those out.
Thank you. I had an opportunity to review and look also at this report that Recidivist put out.
Yes.
So is this the kind of thing that you would normally do or provide because of your contractual relationship with Department of Corrections? Is this something that Recidivist and it's, not handsomely paid folks normally do? Who, and then finally, if you're not doing this independent of Department of Corrections, is Department of Corrections providing you the data for you to be able to do a presentation like this?
So I would say, yes, a presentation like that falls into some of the goals from the contract. I think one of them was to guide policy and planning. And I just want to make clear, we have been working very closely with the Department of Corrections, which is a part of the state of Tennessee. We also work for you. And so to the extent that you're interested in insights about, sentence length and sentence distribution and recidivism rates, those are things that we are capable of providing. A lot of what we do is also trying to bring clarity through visualization of information. So perhaps the department would already have information that it established, and we would basically just bring our designers to make that easier to interpret. And so some of the elements of the analysis in that report was work that our analysts did, and some of that was just sort of offering insights into work the department had already done under their own methodologies.
So part of it is information that Corrections sent to you.
Absolutely.
So that you could extrapolate the data.
Absolutely.
I get that. On page 13 or slide 13 of your presentation, you talked about the variance between recidivism rates for the three categories based upon somebody's working for credited time, the variance of those 6%. So if somebody did the maximum things they could do as it relates to try to get out early based upon the data, is based upon your data, is it generally speaking the 6% variant between those offenders, or does it change dramatically based upon the offense for those people that recidivate?
Two things are true in there. One is, as you vary the offense, the range, the length, all of those things, there are, of course, variations in what that looks like. Somewhat notably, the principle of the group with the fewest credits being the highest level of recidivism, and the middle being the middle, and the most credit earning being the bottom, remains true across those variations.
Okay. And the reason why I was asking about the report too is because just didn't know how we get to the point of or being able to understand between who is directing you to report to generate these reports, or are you doing it on your own? To reiterate what I thought you said earlier, you're doing these reports based upon your own volition, based upon what you perceive to be a part of the contract that you currently have with corrections.
To some extent, my understanding of the contract is that we're supposed to surface insights that we're able to discover within the broad guidance from the department. And so the broad guidance from the department included an investigation of the distribution of sentencing credits. And as we explored that, that's what guided us to produce this report.
Right. Just for I would like to know question. Do you think there's any offense that someone creates that someone should pay 100% of the time for as a recidivist? Do you feel like that there are certain crimes that someone should have to do, or do you think
really importantly for recidivists, the only should we can imagine is that people should know what happens when you do what. We're not sort of putting out normative views. We're saying if you do this, this is what happens next.
Right. So if the state of Tennessee put in TCA that for offense A, you're going to do 100% of that of the time associated with that crime, you don't have a view on that. I mean, recidivist doesn't have a view.
The view would be, here's how likely it is that that person reoffends. Here's how likely that person succeeds in the community. Our view would just be the data.
Okay. The point is, the question is that if someone commits a crime, to me, it seems pretty simple. It's either a yes or no answer. Yes, there are certain offenses that and an aggravated assault on a child. I mean, do you feel like that crime, there are crimes that are currently illegal in the state of Tennessee that people should serve 100% of that sentence?
The reason I'll offer one more time that it may be more complicated than that is, let's imagine that somebody committed a horrible crime against a child, and let's imagine it was true that if they didn't have access to supervision, or if they didn't have the ability to earn credits, they might be likely to commit another horrible crime against another child.
Mm-hmm.
We would not want to wade into saying what is the benefit to the family of the first victim in contrast with the risk to the next future victim.
Mm-hmm.
Those aren't things that you can put on the scales of justice through the lens of data. And so that's why we stick to representing what the data says.
Yeah. And it's one of those interesting things in Tennessee. We want to extend grace because we have been there, but in some certain instances, there's certain crimes I think that people should do the full amount. And so if you're helping us extrapolate data and providing tools for Department of Corrections, I think it's interesting that we should do that. Finally, Ms. Karsner commented on this previously. One of the questions, as it relates to your report and then corrections fiscal note, I guess the question is, can you tell me how did you get to the total number that you came up with in your report? And then for corrections, could you tell me how you did? I think Ms. Karsner was able to give us a breakdown, kind of how she came up with it, and a comparative analysis of those two. Do you agree with her analysis of what the perception or the perceived differences are could you tell us about that real quick? And I know the members are getting antsy. I get 47 and a half minutes of their attention, and then everybody's ready to go. And then go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, we received that from the department, and I think they can speak to the methodology best.
We'll be glad to do that. And we do acknowledge there was some difference, between what we presented as our fiscal note calculation and versus what fiscal review uses. And that's pretty normal in the process. And we never agree 100%. But what we can do is, like for the one example in recidivism reports, I'll let our subject matter expert, our director of fiscal and budget, Ms. Lisa Parks, go through that particular example on how we calculated that, if you'd like.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. I think what the initial issue is that the data set initially in April of 2021, we were asked for a legislative request for some data, and we provided that. And then we also provided an update to that data like in October, November. And it appears, because we actually sat down and went through and did the fiscal reviews calculation and TDOC's calculation, that information is what was used for this fiscal note, specifically all the fiscal notes. We use a consistent data set that's been used since 2009 with the memo that was given to us. I was trying to write down a lot of things with the presentation, couldn't get it all digest, but some of the things that I did
We'll be happy
know-
to send it to you.
Okay, that'd be great. We did cap all our data at year 10. It may have started in year 1, but that's consistent with that 2009 memo that we were given, so we're following those directions. There was a mention about a total dollar amount. Those unspent funds will revert yearly, so we may get them in the first year, but they're gone. We don't have any carry forward authority unless there's legislation that's passed to give us that authority. So that's gone. There won't be an aggregate total for any of those. Let's see. And also all of our data, it's based on primary offense, unique offender. So something was mentioned about the way that data is, but it is specific, like CFO Irvin had mentioned. We take the father's share out, we drop it off, and we'll use the most recent data for that. So I'm not really sure on that comment on how the data is derived, because it is all from STS within Thomas, within our system. So the average admissions on the aggravated burglary, we started with 1,184 admissions, which that was the 10-year average, and fiscal review started with 708. We used the recidivism discount year 2 because the directions that we were given from the 2009 memo says that you will use year 2 recidivism discount for anything over 2 years. And also they had used year 1. And so then that gets it down to the 736, which is in recidivism, their handout that they gave to everybody. And then I think fiscal review, I know fiscal reviews was at 478. So we had 736 versus 478. We had the average length of sentence from our data at 5 years, and fiscal review is at 2.77. So that average time served was also off by 1.94 and 2.16. So that ends up being an additional time served. It was almost at 3 years on our calculation at 2.84, and fiscal review was at 0.83. So that was a difference of $31 million just based on that wrong data set that was started with.
Thank you. Shirley Hazelwood, I think you had a question.
I do have a follow-up, and I apologize. I probably just wasn't listening well, but I'm still not clear. The report, I don't have a nice color copy like our chairman, but the report, Truth in Sentencing, Public Safety Implications of Credit Earning, I'm still not clear on who requested this and who generated it,
So
how it came to be at this particular time.
in broad strokes, the department is aware of the importance of sentencing on their operations, and Recidiviz is supporting the department in their planning and operations. And one of the early areas of data analysis we worked on was with respect to sentence credits. And so both for recently passed and for prospectively future legislation, one of the ways recidivism can help a department is to better understand either what the impacts of something that was recently passed are starting to be, and for something that might be passed soon, what might the implications be? So hopefully that will support the state in making decisions that are good for outcomes.
And I hate to be thick,
Please,
and
no,
I'm
I
sure I'm
welcome it.
being, but who raised their hand? Did the department say, could you all do a study for this on us? Or did you all say, look, we can help you department with this? Who actually
So
generated the request?
I would frame it as the department said sentencing is important. We want to better understand our sentencing data. And then we took a look at all of the elements related to sentencing and included some aspects of that in here.
And then one follow-up question, I promise that I'll quit. On the dashboard.
Yes.
I heard what you said about there being personally identifiable information, and so you have to be careful as what's on the public dashboard. But I had an opportunity to look over the shoulder here and look at the Pennsylvania piece, and it's basically like 3 or 4 charts. Is there more to the dashboard that the department has access to, and that's only the public piece?
Correct.
And when, as a legislative body, could we get a look at what that would look like? Again, not interested in seeing personal information, but I would like to see the tool. That doesn't tell me anything. So I'd like to see the real tool that is being developed.
So that, funny enough, was part of the conversation right from the get-go, was the difference in the dashboards, but also the availability of that. And it's always been the intention that we would want you as the legislature to have access and view this information. Obviously, once it's compiled and the dashboard's ready, or at least enough in a sense that something formalized is put together, we would welcome providing that information and allowing you to have a look at that.
Thank you, because again, at this point, it sort of looks like pig in a poke, if you'll pardon an old Southern expression. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I had a quick question too, and I don't know if it's centered around this or not, but I didn't know if the department could share with me. Last year, we hired, or your department hired Deloitte for $1 million to do a contract for them, with them as it relates to your department. Do you know what the purpose of that contract was for? And what the purpose they were trying to deliver information to the department is? Are you guys aware of that?
That one was kind of, as I'm new in this role, so
Okay.
there's a gray transition period that I'm still playing catch up on. So I will defer over. Do you have that?
No, I'm not aware of it.
The reason why I asked is I noticed in this year's budget, Deloitte had a $1 million contract with corrections last year. They've requested, or there's an appropriation for another, and I'm the appropriations guy. So there's an appropriation for another $1.5 million with Deloitte for corrections this year. And I just wondered, obviously we have a discussion today around $400,000 or $450 over 3. Just didn't know, do we know, I'm not a soothsayer, but based upon your facial expressions, I would say you need to get back with me on what this $1 million and 1.5 million, 2.5 over 2 years would be for. If you guys could do that, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Representative Sparks, I think you had a question.
No, I was just going to mention Dr. Deming, if you know who Dr. Deming was, had a quote that said, in God we trust, all others bring data. And Dr. Deming is, turned around the Japanese economy. I just wanted you with your data collection looking forward. We incarcerate more people than this country incarcerates more people than any other country on the face of the earth. To me, that's strange. That's something that somebody needs to look at the data. Why is that? How does that exist? But I wanted you to look at 2 things in my county. Just go look at PCC, Rutherford County. My county got charged with extortion. They settled a $14 million lawsuit. This existed for years. I don't know how it existed. Where was everybody at? Where were the leaders? Where was the data? I mean, these are people that the poorest of the poor, just in a racket. It just astounds me that this exists in our country, in my community, and nobody done anything. Also, my former police chief, I had the opportunity to preach her funeral 2 years ago. She was a mentor of mine, Sally Walls. She passed. She was the first female chief in the state of Tennessee. And she was calling me a few years ago and she said, she said, my grandson, he was in jail over drugs, incarcerated. He said he can't get out of prison because he hadn't finished a class and they have no instructor to teach a class. Like, nah, I'm thinking she's got something going on. And that was true. I went and met with the department. They had no instructor. And I'm thinking, how many people are bottlenecked there? How come no one studies this? And Deming would talk about studying your cost. Abraham Lincoln was talk about studying your cost. So I just wanted you, as you're driving to Memphis and Knoxville, just pull up PCC. That story made it nationwide. There was no voice, there was no lobbyist for that. Also, my taxpayers were on the hook for some of that money too. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. I have one more question, and I think we're done. I don't have anyone else on my list. Who, and I guess this is for you, General, who in the department released the reports as it relates to this fiscal note or this bill? Who released this report to Right on Crime and the AFP National Crime Group? Does that something your department normally releases to third-party groups, or was that done through Recidiviz, or did they just how's that information released?
Here, okay. As I understand it, so the permission was given by the commissioner for release of the report.
Okay. And so when the commissioner, but it's not unusual for a commissioner to release report data to third-party groups.
No.
Okay. Okay. I do not have any other people asking questions. We're going to go, well, we won't go back in session for a second, but want to thank each of you for coming and your testimony today. It's a very important process as it relates to transparency, not just in transparency's sake, but also in data. So thank you for coming today. Do the members have any further questions? If not, we're going to go back in session. So we're back in session. We will adjourn to call the chair. Thank you.
Check 1 2.